Boa tarde a todos, sejam bem-vindos ao último dia do 5º Simpósio Internacional de Música Nova, que também a gente vai apresentar agora nossa última sessão de comunicações orais. Hoje nós seguiremos o mesmo modelo que nós adotamos nos dias anteriores, e nós vamos apresentar então 2 comunicações e na sequência nós vamos abrir o espaço para discussões, perguntas que vocês tenham, que podem ser enviadas para os palestrantes através da ferramenta de chat do YouTube. Sintam-se à vontade. Welcome to the last day of the 5th International Symposium of New Music. Today we will have our last session of paper presentation. Well, this activity will be mainly conducted in Portuguese, but if you have any questions in English, you can write on the chat and we can translate for you. Have a nice presentation. Nesse momento, nós vamos apresentar, então, a primeira sessão, a primeira apresentação dessa sessão, que é Dragonslayer, Musical Composition and Mythical Thought, por Luigi Antonio Irlandini, da Universidade do Estado de Santa Catarina, Brasil.
Good afternoon. My name is Luigi Antonio Irlandini, and I am going to talk about musical composition and mythical thought in a specific piece that I composed in 2017 called Vritraham for baritone saxophone and percussion. In this piece, the Vedic myth of Indra slaying the cosmic dragon Vritra suggests structuring procedures, instrumental sound sources, and sound images. The discussion of some of the compositional processes in this work, as they were suggested by mythical thought, illustrates the composer's idea of composition as cosmology. The endless serpent, who for so long as he was one abundance, remained invincible, is disjointed and dismembered as a tree is felled and cut up into logs. The idea of composition as cosmology creates a new relationship between musical and mythical thought, explored also in many of my other compositions since 1988. Mythical consciousness lies buried under several layers of historical and empirical thought, which sees it as something from a primitive phase of the human being, long overcome by rational and intellectual consciousness and science. For that reason, any approach to myth has been criticized as nostalgic and naive. A connection between ancient myth and contemporary music seems like an absurdity for many people. In fact, we cannot hypothesize or presuppose ancient myth without some problematization, as if it were a form of consciousness readily alive or natural for late capitalism societies. Nevertheless, it is such a connection, music composition, and ancient Indian myth that resides at the center of my everyday life as a composer. And I feel safe in the company of these myth scholars because they support the view that, especially when there is an involvement with the arts, ancient myth is not unreachable to us. Mythical consciousness is accessible to us. And I feel also safe with these composers because they provide vibrant examples of myth-music connections. The exploration of myth in conjunction with music composition needs the attitude of not equating myth with lie. It requires recognizing that myth may not be real, but it is true. Concerning compositional practices, this exploration cannot consist in the simple borrowing of exotic narratives, providing a programmatic support to which music becomes an accessory. In my case, it is about structuring musical time that relate to images and ideas from myth and spirituality, so that the mythical image and the musical time structure and experience are integrated as a cosmology. The piece, Vritraham, is for a baritone, saxophone, and 2 percussionists, or 1 percussionist. The instruments are basically metal percussion and membrane percussion, and the piece is mostly for bass drum. Vritrahan is one of the many epithets of the Vedic warrior god Indra, Lightbringer, space maker, god of rain, lightning, and thunder. The word means slayer of Vritra, the cosmic dragon or serpent. Indra's deed, the slaying of the dragon, is recounted in several hymns of the Rigveda. And the myth goes like this. It's very simple. Vritra had enclosed the waters, or rain. Indra kills the dragon and releases the water, making them flow for humanity. The myth interpretation that I follow comes from these 3 Vedic scholars, Ananda Kumaraswamy, Janine Miller, and Antonio de Nicolas. Vritra, the dragon, stands for the Asat, or non-existence, the whole unmanifested and undifferentiated primordial chaos. The slaying of the dragon is the sacrifice that creates the world of phenomena, Sat, or existence. Vritra enclosed the waters, understood as primordial substance. In this quality, as he who encloses and constricts all manifestation and existence, all gods, beings, the universe, he is Tad Ekan, that one, the progenitor and first principle which contains all things. The constrictor only releases existence from its embrace by means of a battle with the dragon slayer Indra, who personifies the expanding force, not as a different principle, but as a progenitor's son, or alter ego. In the same way as within chaos lies concealed the principle of light, of order, of cosmos, of life-giving energy. The act of slaying the dragon is a continuous, ever-proceeding creative act, an eternal beginning that makes existence, Sat, emerge from non-existence, Asat. It is a continuous, daily process by which Indra modifies the primeval state of undifferentiation into a differentiated world with distinct realms, sequence, time, contrasts, light and darkness, just like music. The analogy between Indra and the composer comes automatically from the fact that both have the role of liberating manifestation. They are both expanding forces. Indra liberates the manifestations of the world of phenomena. The composer liberates the manifestations of the world of musical sounds. And I should add here, the performer does the same. This, however, is just an analogy. It does not yet create a significant bond between the myth and the music. Furthermore, Vritraham doesn't tell the story of Indra slaying Vritra. It is not a narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. The mythical narrative and its images are present in or invoked by the music, mostly in the circular, non-linear, and non-chronological way of the Ordin principles that structure the work's musical becoming, and are immanent in it. I'm using here Ordin because of Xenakis, who used the term entente to refer to that which changes along the musical time, and the term Ordin to everything that can be thought of as without change, due to a before and an after. Thus, the notion of a programmatic music addicted to a predicament of 19th century musical aesthetics is not applicable here. The mythical images of Indra's battle with Vritra do take shape of evocative sounds recalling thunder and lightning. They also indicated the use of friction drums, lion's roar, and Brazilian cuica, because these instruments convey symbolically through their sound production technique by rubbing against a string or a flexible rod attached to the drum's skin, the creative modus operandi of sacrifice. By employing such instruments and other techniques that emphasize the rubbing aspect of sound production, such as tremoli and frullati, the work's sonorities acquire a visual, concrete connection with the more abstract aspects of the myth. But the mythical images also suggest the agonistic dynamism between sound events, a dynamism that has the nature of a fight or combat between the musical events or energies. Agonistic dynamism is how time passes in Vritrahan. Constriction versus expansion. Indra and Vritra complement each other because the slaying of Vritra is the sacrifice of Vritra. Indra and Vritra are each the obstructor of the other. There cannot be both at once. In a manifestation, that is, within the virtual time of the musical work, the complementarity of manifesting and non-manifesting takes place in the complementarity between sound and silence, since these are, in the world of music, the elements in which presence and absence are most clearly revealed, precisely as manifestation and non-manifestation. Composing this musical agonism between Asat and Sat involved realizing two things. One, the idea that existence comes from non-existence. This suggested the need for giving special attention to the envelope of sounds, particularly the way a sound exits from silence, the attack, and how it re-enters silence, the decay. With the creation of a convincing tension between these two elements, sound and silence, silences are heard as non-existence in the sense that they contain sounds. These, on their turn, break out from silences. Sound bursts out of silence. The second thing is the sounding aspect of silence, or the silent aspect of sounds. De Nicolas mentions that Asat embraces the whole spectrum of sound from its absence to its plenary confusion. Non-existence in music would not only be the absence of sound, but also something like a white noise, a sound containing all existing sonorities synchronously. This idea was withdrawn because metaphorical white noise obtained by the piece's musicians playing randomly all sounds possible in their instruments would create too active a texture that could lead to its association with the Sat instead of the Asat. However, the Vedic idea of inactivity or non-action, nirriti, provided a richer concept of silence. As far as inactive sounds can act in the modality of being in the world of Asat, they partake the essence of silence. Goldheuter pointed out that silence is also monotony, high level of redundancy, reverberation, sketch, non-pretension, delineation, transparency, simplicity, austerity, and meditation. All these elements contribute to a manifestation of silence as non-existence that is not just a pause or a rest, but a sound that imitates its own absence and which is therefore restricted, limited by the idea of silence. Such sounds are those which tend not to move, or that are like a false movement. In the saxophone, sustained or articulated rhythmically polarized pitches or sonorities. In the percussion, tremolando sounds on the bass, drum rolls, woodblock, cymbals, or tum-tums, and sonances, among others. Sonance is a sound that has only an attack and then only decay. The compositional process is the cosmogony of the acoustic universe of the musical work. It is the action or combined actions by which the endless serpent is disjointed and dismembered. Therefore, the first mutilating act is the first decision in the pre-composition, the decision which will begin the process of extracting musical time from its non-existence. In Vritrahan, this first step takes the shape of the Vedic poetic meter Trishtub, as the chosen pattern of rhythmic and temporal articulation in several layers, starting with the macroform. The Trishtub, as a rhythmic pattern, corresponds to a sequence of 11 short and long syllables. of which the first, third, and last may be either long or short. The macroformal Trishtub in Vritraha is the following fixed sequence: short, long, short, long, short, short, long, short, long, short, long. As the first level of dismemberment of the serpent, the macroformal Trishtub creates 11 musical sections, the syllables, grouped in 3 musical parts, A, B, and C. This grouping is given by the Trishtub itself. Each of the 11 syllables of the macroformal Trishtub are further subdivided in a second level or layer of rhythmic organization, the middle ground level, where the macroformal syllables are themselves subdivided by the Trishtub fixed sequence shown above, sort of like a little fractal. Also, the microformal Trishtub appears as the surface level. But it is in the middle ground level that the agonistic dynamism between Sat and Asat takes place. In this picture here, I have section A1, which corresponds to the first macroformal Trishtub syllable. And it's a very, very simple realization of this agonism. Time's up. My presentation is finished, and may it have been a good teaser for you to be interested in reading the paper. Thank you very much for listening.
Boa tarde, obrigado, Irlandini. Agora nós vamos proceder para o segundo paper. And now we will proceed to the next paper. Some compositional approaches in the practice of live electronic music from the perspective of technique and technological tools. O artigo, the paper, foi escrito por Vinícius Oliveira e Thales Pessanha, da Universidade Estadual de Campinas, Brasil.
Hi, my name is Vinícius, and together with Thales, we will talk about the paper Some Compositional Approaches in the Practice of Live Electronic Music from the Perspective of Technique and Technological Tools. The objective of this paper is discuss some aspects related to technique, poetics, and aesthetics in live electronic music. For that, we will reflect on the continuity between creation, technique, and technology, try to identify different technological phases of development in the language of live electronic music. At the same time, link with some ideas of the philosopher Gilberto Simondon and the composer Helmut Lachmann, also with some ideas that José Henrique Padovani discussed in his thesis, and describe some particularities of compositional process of 2 pieces, Spasmos for trombone and live electronics, and Caminhos que me levam for clarinet and live electronics. The musical language in the context of live electronic music followed the trajectory of technological progress over the years. Since the first studio experiments in the 1950s, the technique and compositional métier has been transformed, and as technology developed, new tools, technical contributions, and poetic approaches emerged. The different languages explored by the practice of live electronics are the result of this reciprocal relationship between technological development and the creation of new musical tools and new practices. As Boulez said, instrumental virtuosity together with technology in its various forms of media coverage influence the composer's creative gestures and thus shape his compositional practice. We can think of these technologies using the creative practice within the scope of live electronics, such as studio hardware, computers, softwares, among others, as technical objects. According to the philosopher Gilberto Simondon, a technical object is the result of a process of sedimentation and consolidation of the human thought materialized in mechanisms and technical elements aimed at specific purposes. So the genesis of these technical objects takes place first from an abstract object, which becomes a concrete object. In other words, there is at first an assembling of the individual technical elements that takes place in an abstract and imaginary way, based on isolated functionalities. In a second moment, the assembling of these same elements established among themselves and an ecosystem, linking to them a stable equilibrium point. So any change or disturbance in one of the constituent elements of the system would compromise the function of the object as a whole. In fact, taught an exploratory tactile experience with such devices and tools, the possibilities offered to creation can be greatly expanded and modulated. Technical objects can act in the creative process, not only enabling the technical realization of a work, but also transform and enriching the set of images that populate the process of invention and imagination. So according to Simon Don, the mental image is like a relative independent subset within the living being. When it appears, the image is a set of motor tendencies, long-term anticipation of the object experience. During the interaction between the organisms and the environment, it becomes a system for receiving incident signals and allows the perceptual motor activity to be carried out progressively. These images, even when the subject distances himself from these machines and technical research, start to favor new cognitive contributions and integrating the affective emotive resonance of the experience, they become a symbol. From the universe of symbol organized internally, tending to saturation, the invention may rise. Another thought that may eventually find some resonances in Simondon's ideas exposed here is addressed by Helmut Lachmann in the text Überkomponieren. In this text, the composer generally makes some reflections on the practice of composition based on three propositions. The first says that composing is reflecting on the means. The second says that composing is building an instrument. And the third says that composing is not directing yourself, but letting yourself arrive. These three notions are interconnected in a way that one idea leads to another. So there is a continuity between each of these statements. In this presentation, we will focus only on the first two propositions. The first says that the practice of composition already takes place in the act of reflecting on the means. Here, Lachmann refers to means as all aspects related to musical and sound material, from the most varied timbres and instruments, technical research, equipment, modes of sound production, notation of idea, and their realizations. In short, any musical possibility that permeates the composer's imagination. In an attempt to bring these ideas closer to Simondon's thought, we can say that the means to which Lachmann refers are constituted and strongly influenced by symbols and images resulting from the contact and experience provided by the technical objects. In its form, this imaginative and reflective contemplative moment on the musical sound possibilities brought by this collection of image and abstract idea that populate the composer's imagination, Lachmann developed the second proposition. This gives rise to a creative process whose essence is a tactile exploration to bring the compositional process closer to the conception of an instrument. As Lachmann said, perhaps my second observation would sound more evident like this. Composing is building an instrument and then playing it. Now I will talk about the technical transformations and development of live electronic music and try to identify some technological phases of development of live electronic music over the years. The first forays into the field of live electronic arise from the context of technological adaptation dating back to late 1950s. Motivated by the desire to transfer the analog procedures from the studio to the stage situation and incorporate them into live performance, the first experiments aimed at the use of synthesis and processing devices to generate and transform audio in real time emerged. By coupling these devices to traditional instruments, the live electronic music incorporates into its creative practice the idea of technical instrumental extension. The notion of that was explored compositionally and poetically on large scale in works from that period on. This series of technical and poetic processes make it possible to expand, deform, and transform the sonic possibilities of musical instruments associated with the most diverse process of transformation in sound generation. It's remarkable that a piece such as Solo by Karl Stockhausen explore temporal process of delay and feedback from the reading and recording of magnetic tapes during the performance, while seeking a very flexible and open structuring of form. The possibilities opened by the live electronic regarding the reproduction and temporal displacement of the material recorded during the performance and its feedback seems to have influenced the very conception of the temporal structure of the piece, stimulating the search for a compositional syntax that would dialogue with analogous to the technical procedure explored with time and form. At the end of 1980s and early 1990s, with the development of MIDI, the possibilities posed to live electronics were considerably transformed. Working with parametric information of sound, which can be processed in real time to control sound processes more finely and contextually. The use of MIDI protocol marked the development of music computing in real time by introducing the first methods of machine listening. So the use of MIDI associated with machine listening techniques contributed to the emergence and development of interactive music systems. These systems are software specially designed to interact with live musical performance and are characterized by ability to change their behavior in response to musical input. This approach brought to the creative practice of live electronic the possibility of conceiving interactive systems or technical sets which have a certain autonomy concerning the instrument attached to them, often approaching the behavior of a performer. Philippe Manoury was one of the pioneer composers to incorporate interactive music systems into his composition. Jupiter for flute in live electronics and Pluton for piano and live electronics are emblematic pieces in this respect. Softwares such as Maximus P, Pure Data, and Super Collider emerged from the second half of 1990s, driven by the expansion of digital audio processing methods and with the popularization of personal computers. This is a consequence of the microprocessor revolution that began in the 1950s, as well as the emergence of domestic market and the large-scale development and production of 16-bit processors in the following decade. The diffusion of this software and hardware boosted the practice of live electronics on a large scale, as it allowed the musical community great access to these tools, which until then were very restricted to artists linked to large centers such as UNICAMP. So at the same time in which environment based on visual programming allowed the exploration by artists without specialization in computer programming practice. The development of these tools opened up new possibilities, leading to the conception of more elaborate techniques for extracting and measuring sound information developed by the field of music information retrieval since the 2000s to nowadays. The incorporation of these new tools to musical practice in the context of interactive music systems and live electronics points towards a creative approach that increasingly seeks an extensive use of the computer to allow greater complexity and refinement of strategy regarding the integration between instrumental vocal writing, performance, and computational procedures. Now I will talk briefly about some compositional processes and concepts in spasms for trombone and live electronics. In this piece, the phenomenon of spasm brought to light the idea of sudden contractions and movement that propagates in various directions. This image present in the plane of ideas was used as a poetic and aesthetic concept that guide the conception of trombone-electronic relation as an imaginary instrument. So the characteristics, mechanisms, and modes of operation of these imaginary instruments reflect the properties present in the poetic image, which served as a trigger and a guide for the creative process. So expansions and contractions of harmonic intervals and tempo performed by an harmonizer in the time stretch, as well as microtemporal process such as granular synthesis and sound specialization associated with all this process associated with instrumental gestures, were the strategy adopted to bring to the notion of irregular, special temporal, melodic, harmonic movements and contractions. The procedure of playing this imaginary instrument, constructed from the image generated from the idea of disordered movements, and by coupling the trombone to such process, was of the principal compositional path in the creative process of spasmos.
Em Caminhos que Me Levam for Clarinet and Live Electronics, the musical ideas were worked through an excerpt from the Adagio contained in the Concerto for Clarinet in A major by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, whose restructuring took place in order to gain a new language and greater spatiality in time, enabling a new creative process and greater interaction with the electronics. The sound trails triggered by the electronic part, whose composition was based on frequency shifter, delay, and transposer processes, allows an interaction between the interpreter and the real-time synthesis that trigger footprints in which the accumulation generates new material that emerges from the paths traced by the choices of the Markovian structures that were also worked in this piece. From what we discussed in this presentation, we could see how the technological evolution and the transformations that hardware, software, and all the technical apparatus involved in creative practice came to shape the language of live electronic music. These tools, as technical objects, bring to light an amount of creative possibilities, not only in the technical realization of a work, but also in a more conceptual and poetic conception. In an attempt to bring Simondon's concepts closer to the ideas discussed by Lachmann in his text Überkomponieren, we saw that it is through a tactile experience that these tools enrich the palette of possibilities offered for creation, thus favoring new technical and poetic contributions, and consequently transforming the creative practice in the context of live electronic music as a whole.
Thank you, Vinícius. Thank you, Thales. Obrigado, Vinícius. Obrigado, Thales. We will now proceed to the session of discussion. You are invited to place your questions on the chat, and we can translate and read. This section of the discussion will be conducted mainly in Portuguese. Obrigado, Vinícius. Obrigado, Thales. Nós agora vamos proceder à parte de discussão, né, de conversa coletiva. Nós podemos ler as perguntas, né? Se vocês tiverem, podem escrever no chat, que a gente transfere para os autores. E a ideia, então, é desenvolver um pouco mais as comunicações, abrir para questões do público. Muito bem. A gente tem uma primeira questão aqui, Luigi, que eu acho que é mais ou menos uma conversa que nós tivemos em paralelo. Luigi, você tem gravação da sua peça? Foi feita pelo Luiz Gonçalves, essa questão.
Pois é, não, infelizmente não. A peça ainda não foi tocada. Ela está encaminhada, mas ainda não aconteceu o momento dela. Então, não, infelizmente, não tem uma gravação.
Sim, sim.
Gostaria muito de ter.
Temos uma segunda questão do professor Felipe, que nós percebemos claramente que é uma pesquisa no seu processo composicional. Nesse sentido, como você vê a atual metodologia nas universidades de pesquisa artística, ou artistic research?
Então, a atual metodologia, eu acho que deve haver várias atuais metodologias, né, dentro dessa coisa que a gente chama de pesquisa artística. A pesquisa artística, na minha opinião, assim, agora falando de música, né, e especificamente de composição musical, é uma coisa que sempre houve, né? Pelo menos, vamos dizer assim, no século XX, a composição musical como um ato de pesquisa, né? Que eu chamo de pesquisa composicional. Quando você está lidando com novos princípios ou explorando princípios e técnicas A, B e C, que podem ser novas ou menos novas, né? Isso é uma forma de pesquisa, né? Na minha opinião. Então, assim, eu sei que existem autores que negam que possa existir uma pesquisa composicional, mas isso não é verdade, né? Você vê, por exemplo, trabalho como o Brian Ferneyhough, que não é impossível ser uma pesquisa, né? Então, assim, eu acho que não existe uma única metodologia, não sei se eu entendi a sua pergunta corretamente, mas acho que os compositores que estão fazendo pesquisa estão compondo numa linguagem que é diferenciada, no sentido de que ela para usar um termo francês, recherché, no bom sentido do recherché, ela é pesquisada, ela é buscada, ela é forjada num bom sentido também, né? Ela é criada, né? Por isso que eu chamo isso de cosmologia também, porque é uma forma é uma nova forma de você organizar a música, né? E criar um universo sonoro.
Sim, sim, e com isso nós voltamos ao comentário, né, do conflito entre a pesquisa científica e a pesquisa artística no sentido da composição, né? Sempre tem esse conflito existindo e que já motivou diversos artigos, né? Ian Pace.
Porque essa parte da composição ela é meio cientista, né? Científica, vamos dizer assim. Eu, inclusive, nesse meu paralelo que eu faço entre o processo de composição e a cosmologia, tá? Eu chamo essa parte da cosmologia musical de cosmologia científica, justamente, porque ela é uma pesquisa muito, muito concreta em cima de elementos que, metaforicamente, seriam físicos da música, né? Então, um ritmo é uma coisa que concreta, que você pode ver não vou dizer que você pode pegar o ritmo, mas você elabora ele, você transforma ele, você manuseia, né? Você transforma o ritmo. Então, as alturas, os timbres, a parte tecnológica também, tudo isso é a organização, né, que vai diferenciar aquela obra de uma coisa que é só ruído, né? E transformar ela em música, justamente a organização, é o princípio de ordem. Varese, né? Me ajude aqui, organized sound, né? Música, som organizado, nesse sentido. Então, tem um aspecto científico ali, né? Entre aspas. E aí, o outro aspecto que eu falei muito hoje na minha apresentação é o aspecto contemplativo, que liga esses princípios a justamente uma outra esfera de pensamento, né? No caso, eu trouxe a esfera mítica.
Sim. Obrigado, Luigi. Gostaria agora de fazer uma pergunta para o Vinícius e para o Thales, enquanto a gente aguarda as perguntas dos participantes. Em primeiro lugar, um comentário. Acho que a pesquisa de vocês é super atual e relevante. Muito se discute sobre essa influência da ferramenta para a formação da poética, né? E acho sensacional que vocês estão se debruçando em cima desse tópico que muitas vezes se fala de maneira informal, mas pouco se pesquisa, né? Nesse sentido, eu fiquei curioso sobre a parte mais de contextualização da pesquisa de vocês, né? Ou seja, aquilo que vocês vão fazer antes de desenvolver o processo criativo. Então, nesse sentido, a minha curiosidade seria como é que vocês pretendem estabelecer um recorte para esse estudo? Como, por exemplo, em que técnicas que vocês pretendem focar? Qual o escopo temporal, que os exemplos que vocês citaram são relativamente distantes? As peças selecionadas também para subsidiar esse trabalho. Vocês poderiam falar um pouquinho mais sobre essa parte da pesquisa?
Sim. Bom, a princípio, a ideia para esse trabalho específico é fazer uma contextualização mais geral, né? E como eu tinha falado na apresentação, tentar traçar as fases tecnológicas, né, e criativas tecnológicas, né. Então, desde lá da música com tape, e aí até os dias de hoje, né, o uso, sei lá, de escuta de máquina, até aprendizado de máquina, né, e tentar discutir um pouco mais de forma geral, assim, como que essas ferramentas influenciaram, né, na música do passado e está influenciando agora, assim, né. Vai ser mais ou menos por aí. E as peças vão ser que eu pretendo incluir assim no texto são as peças que eu acho que são mais relevantes de cada fase assim que a gente vai tentar delinear mais ou menos, né? Eu citei o solo do Stockhausen, né? Citei algumas peças do Mano Ri, mas podem entrar outras aí também.
Entendo, obrigado. E parabéns mesmo, acho que é uma pesquisa super, super relevante.
Obrigado.
Obrigado.
Enquanto a gente aguarda novas questões... Desculpa, Thales.
Não, só falei obrigado.
Desculpa. Falhas de comunicação online, né? Luigi, eu teria uma outra pergunta para você. Eu acho que é interessantíssima a forma com que você usa o termo recall em inglês, né, para fazer essa associação, essa remissão que você está tentando estabelecer entre a composição contemporânea e essa referência ao mito, né? Então, nesse sentido, gostaria primeiro de dizer que eu fiquei admirado, já conheço o teu trabalho do A Casa, por exemplo, que desenvolve também um pouco nessa linha, né? Essa relação da música contemporânea com esse aspecto mais mítico, né? Essas referências que você traz no seu processo criativo. E eu queria ouvir um pouquinho mais de você sobre essa relação quase metafórica mesmo, sobre essa ideia mesmo do recall que você trouxe. Acho que isso é super relevante para a consolidação da sua poética. Desculpa.
Eu não entendi a palavra recall. É essa a palavra?
Isso, recalling, eu acho que você usou na apresentação. Eu não lembro agora o slide.
Sim. Então, eu não saberia dizer essa palavra. Não estou identificando ela. Recall. Recall seria lembrar?
Exato, e eu entendi no contexto como se fosse uma remissão, assim.
Então, eu faço uma analogia, né? Uma analogia dessa... Eu estou identificando o compositor com um Deus criador, né? Sem nenhuma intenção de deificar ninguém, né? Sem colocar isso, né? Mas por exemplo, reconhecendo, né, que também não é qualquer um que cria música, que faz música, né? Ou que toca, né? Então, essas atividades criativas são atos criativos e elas, vamos dizer assim, para usar um termo do Eliade, Mircea Eliade, que é um filósofo das religiões, ele diz que todo ato criativo reenacts, ou seja, reatua o ato da criação, né? Descrito nas mitologias ou nas escrituras, né? E mundo afora. Então, existe esse aspecto aí, e na verdade, foi esse pensamento do Eliade que me levou a fazer a pensar na música na composição musical como uma forma de cosmologia, que é uma coisa assim bem forte com a vanguarda, né? Com as novas técnicas. Quando as novas técnicas foram usadas, realmente aquilo ali foi um ato cosmológico musical muito grande, né? E que a gente ainda não assimilou totalmente, eu acho. Não sei se é por aí. Aquela peça que você falou aí, a Caixa, que estreou no SIM, né, no Simpósio Música Nova em 2018, foi em 2018, ela faz uma alusão a esse elemento, né, o elemento que normalmente no Ocidente se traduz como éter, mas não é o éter, é o espaço, né, que é interessante que na concepção dos darshanas indianos, o Akasha é esse primeiro elemento de onde saem todos os outros, né? E que o som é completamente ligado através do som que você percebe a caixa, não tem outra maneira de perceber uma caixa. Essa relação do som, né, que eu trouxe ligada com a reverberação, né, que é aquela música que tem bastante reverberação por causa disso, foi para tentar trazer essa ideia antiga.
Sim,
então, tem vários pontos das minhas músicas que têm relações com ideias antigas. Assim. Tem uma outra parte que é umas músicas que são em cima de animais mitológicos e não mitológicos também, inclusive no terceiro festival de música contemporânea de Nucria, que aconteceu semana passada, online, foi estreada uma música que é um animal mitológico. Então, também aqui temos uma outra relação com essas imagens, né, míticas. Se quiserem, eu posso até, assim, para compensar a falta de gravação dessa música, eu posso colocar aqui no chat, o privado, link para essa gravação, porque a peça foi estreada por um vídeo premiere, né, no YouTube, que está no YouTube. E a peça chama-se Ho-Oh, e a primeira peça de uma série que eu chamo de Bestiário, o Bestiarium em latim.
Obrigado, Luigi. Aí eu vou pedir a ajuda do pessoal que está aqui trabalhando junto com a gente, o Antônio e o Felipe, que não estão aparecendo no vídeo, para colocarem o link no chat para vocês conseguirem acessar, tá? Muito bem, então nós meio que não tivemos mais questões, então eu agradeço a presença de vocês, tá? Foi muito bacana, parabéns pelas pesquisas, que é super interessante. Estou ansioso para ver os artigos finais, né, que estão para ser publicados na Vortex, na edição de dezembro.
Eu também agradeço a vocês pela organização do SIM, mais um ano de SIM. Podemos gritar viva, né? Eu sim. Obrigado pela oportunidade de falar um pouco sobre essas coisas.
Muito
obrigado,
Luigi.
Obrigado, Vinícius. Obrigado. Abraços.
Tchau, tchau.
Abraço.